Hello, welcome. It's good to see you, Alicia. Welcome, Dr. DeSantola, to our interview today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, yeah, we're very excited to find out more about your work with entrepreneurship. To introduce you to everyone that's joining us today, Dr. DeSantola, she has research interests in entrepreneurship, organizational transformation, technology and innovation strategy, and venture capital. She's published in the Academy of Management and Harvard Business Review. She's earned degrees from Stanford University as well as Harvard University, where she earned her PhD in organizational behavior. She's now the assistant professor of management and organization at the University of Washington, Foster School of Business. Thanks again for joining us. We're so glad you can be here.
Yeah, and it's terrific to get to speak to an audience of budding entrepreneurship scholars, because I do think it's such an exciting area of research. And I think there's lots of opportunity for people to have thought-provoking theoretical and conceptual sort of conversations with the literature.
Oh, that's definitely what we've been digging into during the summer seminar. So appreciate that so much. What first interested you in the field of entrepreneurship scholarship, that is?
Yeah, so for me, it was very much a personal motivation based off of my lived experiences. I went to college in California at Stanford, and sort of stayed there after graduation. But I did sort of my master's in engineering. And along the way, I had tons of friends who started and joined pretty well-known sort of fast-moving entrepreneurial ventures. So I felt like the 8 years I spent in the Silicon Valley in some ways was like 8 years of embedded field research on startups. For my own career, I actually went on the other side of the table. I worked for a traditional consulting firm, but I worked in sort of a non-traditional role where I was essentially doing pipeline portfolio strategy and a little bit of sort of advisory corporate venturing with biotech and life sciences companies. And these were companies that were thinking about sort of 10 years down the road, what's going to happen with their portfolio. And so many of them, as a strategic move, were thinking about, should we be investing in acquiring, partnering, co-licensing with startups? And of course, having had the opposite experiences with my friends and seeing them build companies, I empathized a lot more with the little guys sometimes than my large corporate clients. And so when I started thinking about going into academia, I was very inspired by the personal experiences that my friends had had, and also particularly around issues around scaling and growth. Because on the one hand, many of my friends were selling out, or many of their companies were really struggling with issues related to growth and scaling up. And a lot of people felt that it was easier to sell rather than try to grow the company themselves. And on the other hand, when I was in the workplace, many of my large corporate clients said one of the strategic advantages that they could bring is that they could scale a product and they could launch it in a way that the startups that they were thinking about partnering with or acquiring couldn't do themselves. And so I realized that this growth and scaling issue was one that provoked a lot of friction. And I wanted to sort of unpack and study it a little bit more. And I was really surprised that even though it was something that was really important to practitioners, it was not something that really had been studied systematically in research. And moreover, that one where a lot of entrepreneurs really felt like they were flailing around without any guidance. So I thought one of the things I wanted to do was try to bring a little bit of systematic evidence, a little bit more rigor around these conversations, that a lot of entrepreneurs were really relying on gut feel or folklore or other war stories to try to guide them on.
Yeah, it's amazing with entrepreneurship. There's so many areas to study that can have such practical experience then that's brought home for people to be able to scale, for example. It's really great that your consultancy work was able to promote you to move forward that way in your scholarship.
Yeah.
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 Oh, yes, go ahead.
Sorry. Please go on. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Speaking of your scholarship, your article, Startups That Last, How to Scale Your Business Then, how to promote that growth, co-authored with Professor Ranjay Gulati, appeared in the March 2016 issue of the Harvard Business Review. And you described that some invincible or seemingly invincible seeming startups, they're well capitalized, they're flush with customers, they got bright prospects, yet they still run off the rails then too. What did you discover about how internal culture creates cohesiveness as businesses grow?
Yeah, so this was actually a paradox that my advisor Ranjay and I were interested in the very beginning, which was, it's easy to identify startups that fail because they had a bad business concept initially, or they, run out of cash, or they never get track customers. But we were actually really interested in paradoxically startups that were victims of their own success, and that sort of devolved just as they were seeming to take off. And one of the things that strikes me is this is actually both a new and an old problem at the same time. So those of you who are in your PhD programs, I don't know how much you're going to be socialized to Max Weber, but this is like a bias related to the fact that I trained in part with the sociologist at Harvard. But this is like the classic problem. So Weber talks about the classic dilemma of founders starting organizations, and they have this charismatic connection that the followers all feel this energy, and they feel the charisma of the founder, and that's how organizational culture is diffused. But at some point, you have to reify the charisma of the founder into the organization, because either the founder dies or the organization becomes larger, and that's the fundamental transformation problem. How do you take it from being a founder-driven, charismatic organization to a culture that is widely shared? And so this is the classic problems that startups have is how do you go from a system of interpersonal connections where people are drawn into the organization by the founder and to a certain extent are inspired by their initial vision for the company. And by the way, charisma is not necessarily a personality characteristic. As Weber describes it, it's charisma comes from the authority of the founder, from their position, their structural position as being the person who started the organization in the first place. But this is the classic challenge that so many startups deal with, which is how do we create sort of a diffuse sense of organizational culture? But I think that if you think about today, it would be a little bit too simplistic and naive to say that there is one single unified culture within an organization. Certainly, there are toolkits that founders can use to try to disseminate culture. So you can think about how do you create rewards? How do you socialize people, right? That's a big one. What are the symbols that you use in your organization? What are the rituals that you have? What are the bonding, the moments of bonding that you have to make the organization feel and act like one? But as we've seen with the literature and organizational culture, certainly different organizational members are going to have varying experiences of the culture. They're going to use certain elements differently. And we found that one of the big differences happened to be a cohort effect. So old guard and new guard members. So depending on how early you were on the organization, but there are other ways that people experience culture. So I think that this is sort of an interesting area, because on the one hand, you have questions about how does the founder sort of build and create that culture that's widely shared. But on the other hand, you have to take into account that people have these different experiences of culture, and how do you make sure that you account for all of those varying experiences when you're thinking about the organization. So for those of you who are interested in cultural research, I think it's certainly an interesting topic, and definitely one that's worth poking around a little bit in.
Oh, that's great to hear too, because just like you mentioned about scaling up, then that there might be that initial vision by the founder and maybe a certain level of charisma, some greater, some lesser. However, as more and more people come in the organization, they may have their own vision of what the organization should look like. And it might be an old guard versus a newcomer situation that's there too.
Right. And that can create a lot of organizational friction. So figuring out how do you resolve the friction, right? And in some ways, culture is part of a broader conversation about org design, even though they're sort of separate conversations, but there are some parallels, which is, the fundamental problem in an organization is you have to figure out, as the organization grows, how do I divide labor? But then you also have to think, as you get more and more divisions, right, and you get more and more silos, how do I integrate across the organization? How do I integrate effort? And one of the ways that you can serve to integrate effort is through cultural control mechanisms or informal control mechanisms. Of course, there are formal controls. There are different types of organizations, but that can be a good way of bringing people together and having cohesion.
Very good. Oh, and speaking about that then too, you published also new venture milestones and the first female board member with the Academy of Management. And so definitely then as we're integrating then females onto the board as well, then we have this opportunity for culture and sometimes a culture change or shift that's there. You had a data set of 2,425 new ventures, which just sounds amazing. How did you and your co-authors sort, process, and analyze your data? And what do you find to be the major antecedents to a female board member being placed?
Yeah, and I should say that paper, that was in the Academy of Management annual meeting, so it was in the paper proceedings for that, but it's still under review. So I'm hoping that, we will see it in print in a real journal sometime soon.
Right.
So there are different ways of approaching research, and virtually all of my projects involve something that's risky, but I also think is something that's rewarding, which is constructing novel data sets. And the challenge is, if you're using novel data and you are trying to publish a paper, reasonably, reviewers are going to ask questions about that novel data, and you have to convince them of the legitimacy of that data. So there's sort of pros and cons, I would say, to any PhD students of constructing novel data sets. The pro is that you can tailor a data set to the specific question you're asking. The con, of course, is that it's not out of the box, right? Sometimes you can have exhaustive data collection efforts, and you don't know until you've run your models whether or not your hypotheses are going to bear out. Sometimes you can find yourself spending exhaustive time collecting data, and then you have null effects or something like that.
Yeah. And
then also, there is this question of, is this legitimate or not? I was very fortunate on that project. We worked with a data set that had been applied to large, like S&P 1500 company boards. And I was poking around the data set, and I realized they actually seemed to have really good coverage for venture capital-backed startups too. But we hadn't seen anyone sort of apply this data set to entrepreneurial boards. And my co-authors at the time, Julie Babalana and Lakshmi Ramarajan, gave me the resources to hire an RA. And we all hired this RA, and we worked full-time, round the clock, actually verifying the board member data. So it was probably a 4 or 5 month project that it was somebody's full-time job to check this data. And the good news is we found that it was 90% accurate. But if we hadn't gone through that process of legitimating that this data was accurate, by manual Google searches, all these members, we would have no way of knowing whether the coverage was strong or not. So that was an exhaustive process. The other thing that we did with that data set is, all the founders of these companies were not known. So we wanted to identify founders and their gender, particularly the first founder CEO. So again, that was a very manual process. And that one, we actually split that data set up between me and our RA, and it was like an exhaustive manual search process. Similarly, identifying female VCs, we had to hand pick out which firms at which point in time had female VCs. So it is a large upfront investment, but sometimes these kinds of questions you can only answer if you put an intensive data collection effort. And of course, for those of you who are PhD students, I'm sure there are questions. Okay, individual board members. Are you going to roll it up to the organizational level? How are you going to aggregate stuff? How are you going to bring in outside events? Most entrepreneurial ventures will die, so you have to make sure you figure out what are the firms that dissolve, right? What are the ones that get acquired, so that you're not accidentally counting years of the firm's life that don't exist. All these things go into a data cleaning and processing perspective.
How impressive, though, to go through to get the resources, to get an RAM, and to spend so much time and energy to check through to get the legitimacy there. That is just really great to be able to dig into that large of a data set and to validate it. Yeah.
And I really credit my co-authors, Julie and Lakshmi, for really, because, at that point when we started working on this project, I was only a second or third year PhD student, and that they were willing to invest the resources and the commitment to legitimating that data set. Because I, as a PhD student, obviously I didn't have the resources to do it on my own. So I give them a lot of credit for seeing this as an important question and being willing to make that commitment as well.
Right, to see the project through. That's great to have that kind of support that's there.
Right. And so the project is an interesting question. It's evolved a little bit, but one of the interesting questions we're looking at with that project is, to what extent does visibility actually work in promoting the addition of women to boards in entrepreneurial context? So there's become this notion in large company settings that visibility, by shining a light on companies, actually leads to the addition of women to boards, because firms experience what is known as accountability apprehension, as Tetlock would call it, accountability apprehension. Yeah. And so the idea is that if in moments of visibility or under conditions of visibility, firms will be more likely to add women because they realize they're being held accountable. And so now we're looking, does visibility actually work in the entrepreneurial context? And to what extent are there limits around that? And so what we do is find is that visibility in the moment of the IPO, particularly, seems to work in spurring the addition of women to boards, but there are countervailing forces associated with gender-based categorization that it works to get the first woman onto boards, but it doesn't work to get the second. And so this completely disappears when you start looking at the second woman as opposed to the first woman.
Right. It seems like a fascinating area for even a follow-on study then, that to have the first versus why is there such a dearth for a second or even third female board member?
Right. And so for us, the other thing that we've been talking about is there's a lot of research that looks at the consequences of sort of being the only member of a category, whether it's gender-based category or race-based category, all these descriptive characteristics on board, and sort of the consequences for how people behave and act, and sort of the limitations that they feel because they feel a little bit of token status. But sometimes we don't talk about sort of institutional antecedents of how patterns of tokenism get established in the first place. And paradoxically, visibility, which is something that can be very positive, actually serves to institutionalize this pattern of tokenism, because firms feel like they have to perform to add this woman, but then if they've already got the woman, they feel like they've got sufficient cover. So it's sort of an institutional story about how structures get reproduced. You can see, we are sociologically influenced, my co-authors and I. So.
Yeah. Oh, right. A sociology background, which is great. Yeah. And a matter of fact, then going back to this idea then about scaling, in scaling, organizing, and growth in entrepreneurial ventures, you and your co-author juxtaposed two different narratives. The first narrative being putting forward the idea that entrepreneurial ventures endure in their organizational features. But the second narrative then is it posits that firms undergo a dramatic change. So did you find that one of these narratives is more popular and more prevalent, and what do you recommend for future scholarship?
Yeah, and to start off, let me give you some backstory about that Academy of Management Annals piece. So I had come into my doctoral program wanting to write about the topic of startup growth, scaling up, organizational change. And I was really lucky that I found an advisor, Ranjay Gulati, who really supported those ambitions and was excited about that as a research area. But one of the things that I started to realize, and my co-author realized with me as we were approaching these questions, is that while there's a lot of rich literature in org theory in particular that pertains to topics related to scaling up or is related, it didn't really reside in one place. It was very fragmented. And moreover, none of it used the language of scaling up, right? Like they would talk about topics associated with scaling, but it wasn't like you could go into Google Scholar and type the word scaling up and produce a bunch of robust literature. And so there's this fragmentation across time, and there's also a fragmentation across research area. And so anyone who wanted to talk about organizational growth or scaling up found it challenging because there was not a clear jumping off point in the literature or a natural conceptual or theoretical hook to begin when framing a research question. So even though it was a really important conversation from the perspective of practice, it was hard to get the momentum going from research, and we had to find a way to bring those conversations together in order to actually, in some ways, have a good conceptual starting off point for our own empirical project. So that's why we wrote this review piece in the first place. And so because of that, the story of how endurance and change have played out as they relate to scaling is really mirroring a broader conversation that's happened in the organization's literature over the last 100 years. Because we were sort of tracking a larger conversation. So this idea of organizational change through growth is rooted in many traditions. I mean, I talked to you about Weber earlier, but in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, this really started to pop up in structuralist or life cycle theories. But I think a challenge with many of those theories is that sometimes as they were applied, they erred on the side of being perhaps a little bit too universalistic or deterministic. So the idea is that there's this, or at least it's logical extrema, right? That there's this idea that you can prescribe the optimal mode of organizing for ventures at a particular age or size or stage of development. And so rightfully, the pendulum swung in the other way because people started to say, well, there's no like one universal path to organizing. And people started to think about key contingencies And one of the key contingencies that people began to focus on was conditions at time of founding that are going to drive variation in organizational forms rather than convergence over time. And so I think in some ways the endurance narrative was a reaction to how discussions of change had tended to devolve into sort of these very prescriptive models. And so and those universalistic undertones. So I actually think a path forward isn't one narrative or the other. I think it's an integration of those two narratives. And thinking about sort of how endurance and change interplay together. And I think that we can revisit those conversations about sort of startup change during growth, but still acknowledge key contingencies. So one contingency that I'm interested in is how nascent markets, competing in a nascent versus a well-grooved market space, affects startups' developmental pathway. I think that's a super interesting contingency. In fact, Ranjay and I and Pavel Zhelyazkov have a paper that's currently under review where we look at how whether or not you pioneer a nascent market space influences org design as startups evolve. So, and we look at sort of pioneering a nascent market space at the time of the firm's founding. So that's a story about endurance from sort of that initial imprint of like how new that market was, but it's also a story about change because you look at the evolution of the firms over time.
Which actually, that is great that you mentioned that, because my final question then is, what do you believe are some of the most promising avenues for entrepreneurship research? You mentioned about the nascent, innovative entrepreneurial firms and pathways that may or may not be as well established. In addition to those, what other areas do you think are definitely ones that are very promising right now for entrepreneurship research?
Well, it shouldn't be surprising, given that most of my research is focused on scaling up, that I do actually think this story of scaling up is in a really interesting one that to play with. And there's sort of a burgeoning body of literature, but it hasn't really cohered and gelled. And I think that the next 5 or 10 years is going to be when it gels. And I'll say a little plug for this. So I think to the extent that there has been entrepreneurship scholarship, I think it's been focused on a few very punctuated moments in a firm's life. So you see at the time of founding, certainly we've started to get a lot of clarity and cohesion around discussions related to who founds entrepreneurial ventures, moments early in the organization's life. Certainly around fundraising, we've gotten a robust body of literature and the IPO, but those are punctuated moments. And the interstitial periods in between have gotten far less attention. So I think that's a super blue ocean. If you want to target something, looking at those evolutionary periods that haven't been studied. And then I will also put a plug in for there's something going on within the org design literature that I think is interesting. So I would almost go so far as to say there's a renaissance happening in organizational design, and much of that renaissance is inspired both by a resurgence of interest in the study of entrepreneurial ventures, but also the study of nascent market spaces and sort of what they mean for org design. Org design was a topic that was at the heart of org theory from that 50s through 70s periods, but it went a little bit out of fashion. In part because some of the classic studies, again, sort of erred on that deterministic or universalistic pathway. But I think people are starting to get really excited about that. I think there's an active community that's working on it. And so if that appeals to you, I think there's a lot of promising research there, particularly if you're interested in outliers. This is the other final plug I will make. I think that oftentimes we err towards studying means. But I think that sometimes the most interesting theoretical questions can come from extrema. Right. And so, like, what can we learn from a very bizarre form of organizing, super outliers within entrepreneurial ventures, and what does that teach us about the general population and what our assumptions are, what assumptions are right and what aren't right? So.
Right. Yeah, certainly. And that's sometimes where the highest returns are. Those ideas that seem the most groundbreaking then too are often cited as those that only a few people bought into, yet they are definitely incredible. These outliers that are there that sometimes pave a path for others then to follow, which is just really great, definitely. And I like how you mentioned too about the interstitial time periods. For example, we might look at an IPO. What about that run up to the IPO? What's happening in that space then too, which is fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So lots of promising areas of research. And as I said, I'm very excited that there's a community of scholars that are interested in entrepreneurship. I would say that I characterize myself as sitting at the intersection of org theory, strategy, entrepreneurship. But I think it's exciting that there's a community of people whose primary identification is in entrepreneurship, because I'm not sure 20, 30 years ago that would be the case. And I think it's a great time to be interested in entrepreneurship.
Yeah, it's a wonderful field at the beginning of the 21st century to be part of. Yeah, for certain. Well, thank you so much. You have provided us really good food for thought here, talking about your research, and that is just an incredible thing.
Yes, thank you, and have a great day. And good luck to all of you starting and beginning your PhD programs. Take care.
Thank you. Yeah, and good luck to all our colleagues. And we hope that you enjoy just a really great day. And thank you once again.
Sure, take care.